I think Bitcoin is a fundamental reimagining of human civilization. It's only through consensual exchange in a Bitcoinized world that we are productive. Its integrity is rooted in the laws of physics, and it's resistant to politics because it's dematerialized. Bitcoin optimizes our ability to express our will to power and therefore lets us be free.
All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Robert here with me. I thought a great place that we could start the conversation is money is a proxy for power. This is one of the big ideas I think that you've been thinking a lot about and talking about. What does that mean? Money is a proxy for power.
Yeah, I guess I should first probably give a shout out to people that have helped me form these ideas. Saylor's been very noteworthy for bringing this energy element into the discussion of money. Before him, I was really focused on the time aspect. And then people like Lowry started to bring this power projection thesis to the foreground. And when I really started to dissect that, and you look at power through the lens of physics, there's a formula for power, actually. And it has components of both energy and time. So I'm hoping that this framing is a little bit more useful and telling about the nature and history of money. And then but to get there, we have to kind of decompose power itself and start to define it. In my opinion, most people, I think today, when we say power, they think it's this like arbitrary political, like I'm your boss or I'm your statesman, something like that. I can tell you what to do. My willpower is superordinate over yours. But that's all of this political power that we create in our imaginations. There's this other form of power that's very important, which is physical power. And, so money, I guess, this is somewhat obvious. Like if we talk about money in terms of purchasing power, which is what we ultimately want, you don't want, whether you know it or not, you don't want a number of dollars in your bank account. What you actually desire is the purchasing power that money provides to you.
Yes.
So when we talk about inflation being a diminishing of the purchasing power per unit, that's why prices go up, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a parasitic relationship occurring in fiat currency where producers of that currency are basically siphoning power off of those that use it and save in it. So this isn't like an original idea, really. Like, again, what you want in money is purchasing power. So money is a proxy for power. But then it gets interesting, I think, when we break it down into how it relates to the physical dimension of power versus the political dimension.
Okay. Talk about the physical one first. What does it mean, the physical dimension of power?
Yeah. So I think the first, when we start these deep conversations, we need to back up a little bit first. So first thing to understand is that humans are animals, right? We are participating in this Darwinian process of survival. I like to say that, we are basically genetic information encoded for survival or programmed for survival through eons of evolution, adapted to our surroundings to survive. So we are this message, if you will, propagating through blood, flesh, bone, etc. And in that way, all life forms, it's not just humans, obviously all life forms are basically these survival strategies propagating through organisms. And I think this is a good through line too, because your organs individually have their own survival strategy. They've specialized, if you will, in this economy of your body. The organism itself is a macro representation of that. And then even organizations that we create in the world, they behave like organisms, right? They have life cycles, they live and die. In terms of economics, they have to have more inflows than outflows, just like you have to eat more calories than you expend, otherwise you die. So these are all systems of energy or power. And that, like we were talking about the Italian prime minister video earlier that just aired, and she had this great line in there where she said something to the effect of, each of our genetic code is unique, non-repeatable, and therefore sacred.
Yes.
It's like, yes, that's what we're doing. Like, and if you have kids, I have kids, you know what it's like to be a parent, like Mother Nature sort of flips a dial inside of you. It's not something that is really within our control at all. Like we are part of nature rather than just controlling nature. And so in that sense, I think, Nietzsche's famous for his will to power quote. And I think he's right, honestly, but you have to understand power through the physics sense. And so I'll read his quote real quick. Nietzsche wrote, "Even the body within which individuals treat each other as equals will have to be an incarnate will to power It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living and because life simply is will to power. So what we're doing right now, like to breathe, to speak, to think, to talk, to move, these are all expressions of a will to power because, well, to define power in the physics sense, it's ultimately just to move energy across time. So it's the capacity to move. That's what power is in a purely physics sense. And to get into the formula, physics is power equals work divided by time. Work, so I have to decompose that formula further now. Work equals force times displacement, which basically means a force applied across space. So what do we do when we combine that? You basically get power equals force times space divided by time. It sounds ridiculous, but what it basically means is power is just the capacity for movement.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're doing here. That's what we're doing in economics is we're trying to increase the amount of natural resources we can mobilize and bend it to our will to further our wants in the world, to satisfy more human wants in the world.
It reminds me of two things. One is like weapons of war is who can move analog physical assets faster, larger, create more destruction, right? All these things. So if you think of a bullet is basically the ability to project power at a speed and in a very concentrated surface area to penetrate, whether it's armor, a human body, whatever. The other thing is things like an RPG in the most general sense basically are able to puncture armor and then insert a grenade, object to then explode, right? Which is another kind of secondary use of power. So like the weapons of war is very obvious, but also if you think of a corporation, which really is one of the key foundations of the Industrial Revolution and the ability to organize resources and people and capital and all these things. It was done not because people sat around and was like, let's create more bureaucracy, like, oh, we're unorganized. It was done because there was leverage to create more force, more movement, and the ability to increase output.
Yes.
Right? And so in both of those situations, you are creating output. One is for an economic agenda. The other is for kind of a geopolitical or a war agenda.
Yes.
But it is all output.
That's a great example, actually. And obviously, closely related are the weapons of war and the political power structures. And I like the example of the corporation too, because that is an imaginal structure, right? We fabricated that in the imagination of ourselves, and we implement it into the collective imagination, if you will. And I'll expand on what more of this means as we go, but that's, I guess the key point so far is that it grounds out in physics, right? As reality grounds out in physics. If you're not moving, breathing, talking, you're not alive, right? You're not relevant to this socioeconomic game we're all playing with each other. So in economics, the entire point is to increase the division of labor. And we talked about this last time on a previous episode, but basically there's a physical principle that human beings accomplish more working in cooperatively rather than they do in isolation. And so if that was not true, we would not trade with one another. Right? It's not like we just decided to do this out of the kindness of our hearts. It's a very pragmatic mode of being, let's say.
Another kind of point to this, which I think is very interesting. There's a book that I recently read called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And it talks all about 1870 to 1970. And it completely changed the way that I looked at so many different things. But one of the key concepts was pretty much 1870 to like 1900, 1920, somewhere in there. Every single home was essentially an individual node. They were what they called unnetworked. So they were not connected when it came to electricity, when it came to sewage and water and like all these different things. And it basically had to operate in a way where you said you have humans who live inside of this home. They have to get water and food and power and all these different components. And the people in that home went out into the world every day and did the things necessary to be able to do that. And so, it was something like 75% of all people who lived at that time ended up doing jobs that were undesirable. A very large portion of them were farmers and they operated off of the land, like all this stuff. By the time you get to, for sure, 1970, but even as early as like 1920, those homes now had, 4 or 5 different components. They now were networked for electricity. They were networked for water. They were networked for all these different things. And so in some way, while we think of individual versus a group from a productivity standpoint, also on a societal standpoint, if everyone was siloed in a single home and they had to live off the land, there's production that happens.
Right.
But damn, is it powerful when you put all these folks together in a network and they work on, okay, you're going to be the power company,
right?
Right. You make sure we all have power.
Yes.
Somebody else, you're going to be the water company, right? And it ends up bringing people together in a really unique way that ends up increasing economic output.
100%. What did Balaji said this at the conference yesterday? Many apes strong was a line from Planet of the Apes, I think. So when we cooperate, especially when we cooperate intelligently, right? Like you specialize in this, I'll specialize in that. We'll each honor one another's property rights and we'll trade. That's what increases the division of labor and allows us to accomplish way more than the sum of our parts.
Yes.
So, and that's why we tinker. That's why we innovate. That's why we trade, is to achieve greater results with less efforts. That is equivalent to wealth, right? We can do more, satisfy more wants, enjoy more of a luxurious lifestyle, ultimately. Because let's face it, we live in absolute luxury compared to people 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And that is, there's a lot of problems to solve in the world, but if you can solve that one, that at least creates the freedom for people to go and address other problems. So I think it's the most fundamental thing we should try and address as a species. So to do that, and this is among the defining features of humanity, we use open source technologies largely to contribute to that. Language, mathematics, even money, as we've talked about before, like gold, I would argue is kind of an analog open source technology. Everyone could see how it works. No one could do anything about it. So it, took over the world for a number of reasons. But all of these are designed to optimize our coordination. And there's a great term from a guy I talked to named John Vervaeke. He calls these psychotechnologies.
Okay.
So whereas a technology, like a physical technology, increases our fitness to the world or fitness to purpose somehow, a psychotechnology is just something that enhances our cognitive fitness to the world. So the fact that I can make these sounds with my mouth right now and you know what I'm saying, like it's because we're both users of this open source technology called English.
Yes.
And so that is very fundamental to creating that division of labor that creates all this wealth and allows us to engage in the process of civilization. So technologies, psychotechnologies, all really important to human flourishing. But I think a key point that, and this is where I hope this conversation is a little bit unique, these things are all born in the human imagination.
Yes.
Like we always forget to stop and consider that.
Yes.
And when you start to have this lens on the world, when I walk around downtown Miami and I'm looking at all these, high rises and cars and all the software people are using, it can get almost overwhelming. You're like, all of this was just born in someone's imagination and then, many people's imaginations over time. And they go and imprint that imagination into physical reality to create all this stuff. So it's a very key component to all of this that we're talking about. And that's it. So we said humans are animals, but humans are different because humans are animals with very sophisticated imaginations.
Yes.
So we create these tools to increase our fitness to each other and to the world. And again, if you have kids, this is sort of obvious. I have to thank my daughter for inspiring a lot of this. They grow up just playing imaginary nonstop, right?
Yes.
Nonstop. Like new outfit, new role, new name. You're this, you're that. Here's my stuffed animal that's named this. And then we just think kids stop doing that arbitrarily somewhere like in teenage years. No, we don't stop at all. We're doing it right now, right? Like you run a business, several businesses. Those are all imaginal structures, right? People willingly engage in those hierarchies and assume a role in that structure, but it's all imaginal, right? The authority that the boss projects over the employee, like they've connected their imaginations together in this enterprise called the business. And that's what we do. That's how we run the world, is because we engage with our imaginal realities to reshape physical realities in a very sophisticated way.
I think a lot about real estate, like commercial real estate. So there is a couple blocks from here, huge entire block of grass. And it's kind of in a weird part because it's in downtown, but it's grass. There's nothing there. And so I've walked by it hundreds of times. And I've always said to myself, like, somebody's going to do something with that. Somebody's going to do something with that, right? Something could be a strip mall, could be a high rise. Like there's a bunch of different things that you could do. Someone could build a parking deck there, right? Whatever it is. Recently it was announced that they are going to create a very large high rise building that's residential with restaurants and all stuff. Well, when they make that announcement, they say who's going to do it. And what do? They publicize the renderings of what is going to be there. And so somebody sat down and drew, this is what we could do. And they socialized it with the group. And the group was like, that looks awesome. We should do that. People will want to live there. That will create economic activity. The numbers work. Like all of these other things started to follow. But it's not very different than a young kid sitting down saying like, look at this house I drew,
100%.
Right? And what becomes fascinating is, and I think that this was maybe one of the Carlson brothers at Stripe or somebody I saw tweet and was like, you forget when you walk around that things that exist in the world, buildings, businesses, cars, all this stuff, somebody had to have the idea. Somebody had to have the conviction and the courage to go try to build it. And then somebody had to operationalize it to actually say, yes, it's possible to build a car, but what if we built tens of thousands of cars every single year? Yes. What if we were able to actually create lots of concrete? What if we were able to create elevators? What if we were able to use glass for windows and do all this stuff? And it sounds so stupid because you're like, yeah, guys, duh, like there's buildings. But if you really kind of draw it back, it's like human imagination in some way is the same thing like oxygen to the human body.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Without the imagination, you don't really have a society.
There's no civilization, for sure.
Yeah. All you have is just straight up, I kill you, you kill me, I need food for my family. The imagination is what gives order, organization, and ultimately economic productivity.
Super well said. Yeah, we're fighting against, nature gives us plenty of uncertainty to deal with. And the imagination is our greatest defense or weapon against that, let's say. And I don't know if that's the same tweet you're referring to, but someone referred to the entire world as a museum of passion projects. So when you see all of these buildings and businesses and ideas and games and everything that humans create, right, starts here and then through a whole lot of work and perseverance, sometimes if it's successful, it gets imprinted into the real world. And then we just like plug into these realities and take them for granted in a lot of ways. But it's easy to forget how much it took to get to this point. So I guess the point is, most people think kids stop playing imaginary at some point. But I would say if you've got a job, if you use money, if you're a citizen of a country, then you are engaged in serious imaginal play, whether you understand it or not. And I would say if you don't understand it, actually, you're more likely to be possessed by one of those structures. Rather than if you understand how this works, you can just be a voluntary participant, let's say. And so I want to call these something. I want to call these imaginal structures. We often call them hierarchies. You could call them social institutions. You could call them imaginal structures. Yuval Harari in his book Sapiens, I think called these the imagined orders. All these terms, I'm going to use the term symbolic structure.
Okay.
So language is symbolic, right? We're using code to communicate. And then when we press all those ideas together and then push them into the physical world, when we press them together, we create a symbolic structure that gets pushed in the physical world to become a skyscraper or become a battleship or whatever it is. So your company, money, nation states, these are all symbolic structures that we inhabit in this imaginal space. So we're storytellers, right? That's what we're saying here. These are just stories. It's like Jordan Peterson always talks about, we live in stories. First time I heard that, I was like, that sounds ridiculous. Of course, everything's a story because everything's a description of a sequence of events, but that's not, I don't think that's what he meant. He meant something more like this, that we're creating these imagined realities and then we inhabit them like as a member of society, let's say. Plato has a great quote. He said, those who tell stories rule society. This is fucking Plato, right? Like he got this. Very brilliant guy. There's another quote that someone said this reminded them of when I posted this on Twitter. They said, who controls the past now controls the future. Who controls the present now controls the past. So in these
very deep, but very true.
Yes. In these symbolic structures, we've heard this quote, history is written by the winners.
Mm-hmm.
It's very often that the symbolic structure gets written or rewritten by the winner in the domain of the physical, right?
Mm-hmm.
So physical warfare. If a new country undergoes a revolution and a new leader is installed, they'll typically go straight to work rewriting history.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If you go to North Korea today, there's all these statues deifying Kim, whatever his name is.
Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un. So that's how he is dominating the symbolic structure of North Korea, is by deifying himself as part of it.
I think it's even, I believe it, you have to have a photo of him in your home. So it's not just like the public, right. I would say open spaces. I don't know how open they are.
Yeah.
But like literally in your own home, you have to have a photo of him.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so the Yuval Harari thing in Sapiens, his whole punchline, sorry to ruin the book if you haven't read it, but human beings are the animal that can cooperate flexibly in large numbers. Mm-hmm. There's many species that can cooperate flexibly. Mm-hmm. Example escapes me here. There's many that can cooperate in large numbers, like bees, but they can't. The way he puts it is, you can only unite 10,000 human beings on a battlefield under a flag. Mm-hmm. So whereas all these other animals are subject to the Dunbar number or something equivalent for their species, human beings are not. We can combine our forces in a way that no other animal can. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason we're the top of the food chain, basically. And so I think this points to why this struggle has always been for the collective human imagination, right? Mm-hmm. Religion, propaganda, even modern nation statism, where it's much more energy efficient to get people to subscribe to your symbolic structure than it is to force it on them.
Yes.
Because if you force it on them, they're going to, cut corners, backstab you at every chance you can get. And we know this. We know this intuitively. So the game, I guess, is to try and be influential, right? Mm-hmm. And so I want to focus on, we could talk about that for a long time because there's a lot of history there, but I want to focus on the nation state because that's the one we live in today, right? Mm-hmm. This is the dominant symbolic structure in the world. And I'm here, as you were there yesterday, to attend an event talking about the network state, which is this, let's say, embryonic idea for the future of nation states. And there was a small gathering here in Miami and a lot of really interesting ideas thrown around. And one was shared with me that you could actually decompose nation state into nation and state. Sounds pretty obvious, but the nation is more, the root word of nation is natality, I want to say. And this relates to like natal, so like the birth and growth of a people. So this is going to refer to the people, the culture, the wisdom traditions, the modes of being, etc. The state, though, is the like administrative layer or the political apparatus within that area that's really there. It's a monopoly on violence that exists to resolve disputes over resolve disputes of people over scarce resources. So another way to say that is the state exists to preserve the relationship between people and their stuff. So if you create something of value and someone tries to take that from you, recourse to the state is how you resolve that. So we've outsourced the defense of our property effectively. And at its best, a nation state wields political power, and I'm going to get into what political power means shortly, to defend the market process from interruption. So you want people to be maximally free, and to be maximally free, you need strong property, right? You need an integrity of the relationship between you and your stuff so that you can engage in the process of a consensual exchange, increase the division of labor, increase wealth, and therefore increase the collective physical power harnessed by human beings in the marketplace, right? So it's this, and as we talked about last time, I framed this as useful ideas a lot. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's more useful ideas are implemented, whether it's property, whether it's an iPhone or a laptop. These are just better ideas for communicating or accomplishing human purpose. That gives you more movement, more wealth creation. So that's what the state acts as like this insulating layer to prevent that from being attacked. But we've been trapped in this situation with the state for a long time that it tends to start to prey on the very thing it's supposed to protect over time, which has been a real problem.
When you start to kind of unpack the division of labor and a lot of these pieces, it feels like the sum of the parts are more valuable than them individually. But also, when you then overlay things like property rights, you then are able to do something very different, because actually property rights usually are thought of as defense. So you cannot take my property. But in some way, it's also a tailwind to give people more conviction to specialize.
Yes.
So when you think of the farm, why did you have the ability to get water, food, and all the things you needed for you and your family to survive? Because you had no confidence that anyone else was coming to save you, right? Now, when you move to modern society, I don't think that I know very many people who have a farm, because they have greater confidence that the food supply, whether you like it or not, or think it's good or could be improved or whatever, will provide food. And so they have the confidence to not have to go spend time on farming, because they say somebody else in our society has taken on that division of labor. And I am going to go specialize in whatever, whether it's a white collar job, a blue collar job, or anything in between. And so property rights not only protect what you're doing, but it gives you the confidence to become more and more and more specialized and still have the safety net of society that says, yes, food will be at the grocery store. Whether you have property rights or not, if at any point your confidence that food will be at the grocery store or clean water is going to be there, or any of these things that you don't specialize in, if that ever breaks down, that's when all hell breaks loose. And we return back to a world where no one had confidence and they had to be self-sufficient. And there's just not a lot of people that are prepared to do that today.
Today's episode is brought to you by FTX US. They're a safe, regulated way to buy Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They've got very cheap fees, sometimes as much as 85% cheaper than their competitors. There's also no minimum fees, there's no withdrawal fees, or any other hidden fees. Ultimately, FTX US is trying to make it dead simple for you to buy Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They also now have digital stock trading as well, with no transaction fees and no payment for order flow. All you have to do is go download the FTX app today from the App Store and use code POMP, and you'll get some money back every single time you trade $10 or more. Again, go download the FTX app today, use code POMP, and every time you trade $10 or more, they'll go ahead and they'll give you some crypto back. The more you trade, the more you earn. Download the FTX app today.
Yeah, that would be the collapse of the division of labor,
Yes.
the collapse of wealth creation, which is equivalent to the collapse of civilization.
Yes.
It's like I hammer this point so hard. Wealth is demonized a lot. Wealth should not be demonized. It's the basis of the solution to most problems, I would argue. And I think that point you made is so good, because what does that mean, right? Confidence in property rights. That means other people are engaging in this symbolic structure, playing this imaginal game with you. And it's the confidence you have that they'll continue to honor the rules of the game, as will you. Now, if confidence is shaken for any reason, it unwinds the whole thing. The whole thing goes involuted.
If you really think about laws, right, and you were to overlay it with the imaginary game that kids play, the changing of a law is no different than the 5 kids out in the backyard being like, okay, now that used to be out of bounds. Now it's not out of bounds anymore. And then people start running over there and the game continues. Like, that is the exact equivalent of legislation and laws and like all these things that grownups are playing. But also laws in human nature are sometimes at odds. But the beauty of good laws is that it is able to use human nature as and align those incentives so that humans will do what humans are going to do, but do it within some agreed upon framework. And so, I always go back to, like, if there was no laws, would most people go out in the streets and start killing people? Probably not. But if there was no food in a city and families were going hungry, it doesn't matter if there's laws or not. At some point, right? I think there's a saying like, you really see what a man is capable of if he doesn't eat for 3 days.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so it's almost like the laws have to align with the human nature, because you can't have people, like, the laws don't matter if people are hungry.
Yeah.
The laws don't matter if people feel like their life's in danger.
Yeah.
And you actually see this in society. Like, thou shalt not kill is written into law.
Yes. Yeah,
Except for if he's going to kill you, then you can, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, it's a very weird way to look at it, but in some way, the law and human nature do have to align, or therefore society eventually rejects the law.
100%. So much good stuff there. Peterson, again, this idea that what you just said, thou shalt not kill, is written directly into the law. There's a mythological substructure to Western civilization. A lot of it is the Judeo-Christian mythology, right? We would not have gotten to property rights if we did not have thou shalt not kill in our history. Like, that's another important, it's almost like the blockchain of the imaginal structure, right? It's building in layers over time. We didn't just decide out of the blue that we're going to create the United States. I mean, read the Federalist Papers. These guys were diehard Christian, or at least inspired by the Bible to a large extent. And what you said too, like, good laws map onto good incentives. And I would argue that people don't really follow laws, actually. People follow incentives. Right now, if there's a credible threat of force behind a law, then that's a disincentive to break it. So you might follow it for some period of time, but ultimately people are going to bend to their own incentives. And the point with the kids, hey, that's out of bounds, now that's out of bounds. What do you think we're doing with national borders?
Yes.
That's it. This is your country, this is my country.
And there's layers to it. Like, there's national borders, but even if you think of like voting districts, like, that's the one that always cracks me up, right? Is that, like, you ever seen them drawn and it looks like a square, and then in one corner it like reaches out and grabs like a city, right? And comes back. And you're like, if I was just to come up with a random voting city or voting district, that's not the shape that I would draw, right? Now, it may be for good reason or bad reason or whatever, right? And people love to debate that stuff. But, like, that is the drawing of imaginary lines that then feed into a game that is around voting.
Yes.
That then dictates who gets to play what role in the game.
Who benefits from the proceeds stolen from taxation and inflation. That's what that game is, right? You get voted into office, and then you get to decide what to do with the stolen booty. Again, we needed to play that game because we needed to create integrity of relationship between people and their stuff in the physical world. But the problem with that game is that monopolist on violence, the security provider, over time has tended to start to bend the rules to their own favor. The individuals that come into power inside of the state have tended to corrupt the state. And we'll get into corruption a bit later, but
And I also think a key piece of this is that's part of the division of labor, which people tend to forget. Of, like, if you go back 200 years, like, guess who protected your home? You better. Right? Because if you didn't, or you and your equivalent of a neighborhood did not, you were fucked.
Yes.
And so at some point, the farmer said, okay, this other person's going to be the farmer and going to provide food for the village. And this other person's going to provide the security. This other person's going to provide, whatever, the horses or whatever the division of labor ended up being. But you had to have the confidence, not only in the property rights and all this, but they would do their job. Because the fastest way for people to get really interested in self-defense is to look at a group of people and say, you can't protect me. Right? And you see this actually, the place where unfortunately we see it is look at natural disasters. Natural disasters come in and it breaks down so many of the agreed upon kind of structures of a society. And so if you go back to Hurricane Katrina in maybe a decade ago or so now, I remember that there was the National Guard was being called in. And literally you had armed National Guardmen and women who were patrolling Walmart. Because Walmart was selling their physical goods and they were keeping the money in the back because there was no armored trucks to come pick it up. Like, you start to say, okay, hold on a second. Did Walmart call?
Right.
Did an individual in the community? Did the governor? Like, I don't know how it happened, but the reason why we don't have armed soldiers in every single store is because there's a general belief that the local police, the security systems, the technology, all this stuff can protect the goods and the store owner.
Yes.
When that breaks down, it goes back to get armed men here.
100%. 100%. That's a great example where Hurricane Katrina was kind of like a real dose of physical power, totally obliterating all of these symbolic structures, a lot of them premised on
Yeah, I never thought
power.
of it that way. Yeah.
And then, as you said, the armed guards, they coalesce around the money, right, that's being taken in. So political power coalesces to the physical power that money represents.
In some way, you could actually argue, does society put more value on human life or on the money? And if the armed guards or the help come into an area and they go and they protect the money, it opens up a lot of questions.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And thankfully, it's not binary, right? It's not like, hey, there's only one person. Which way do they go? It's a fork in the road. Because at the same time, we had helicopters flying in and rescuing people off of roofs and doing all of these like heroic actions where it was obvious that some value was being placed on the life. But it does start to open up the nuance of a conversation that's like very interesting to think about.
100%. I was actually there for a mission trip after like I guess it was 9 months maybe after.
Okay.
In Bay St. Louis where the eye of the hurricane hit. Did you know the Canadian Mounties made it there before the U.S. National Guard?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
So
on their horses?
I don't know if they were on horses, but they made it down there.
Yeah.
So their symbolic structure, right, was actually being more faithful to the people of this country at that time, which I thought was shocking. And then this one other point on the Walmart thing, had that been Bitcoin though, and the money was dematerialized, there would not be a need to defend the property in a physical way, assuming you custodied it properly. So I'm kind of foreshadowing what we're going to talk about later, but the physicality of money is what leads to the relevance of political power and force, let's say, in the physical world. And the value of human life versus monetary energy, I would argue, again, there's the through line there of power, right? Like, people are a will to power. They're alive. They're useful to other people. They can perform labor. They have ideas. We can think. We can talk, right? We have humans are amazing. Well, the most amazing asset we have, frankly, is us. And so to the extent that you can defend that, right, to protect the sanctity of the individual or that sacred genetic code, as the Italian prime minister said earlier, that's the whole game here.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a bit of a segue, but just on the emergence of the nation state itself, it emerges as a result of the industrialization of military technology, right? There's a reason World War I and World War II were of such a scope, scale, and severity that the world had never seen before. Those reasons were the mechanization and industrialization of war fighting equipment. And I would also insert fiat currency here, that these governments were not on a gold standard, right? So they would suspend redeemability for gold, start printing money to finance the war up to the point of hyperinflating the currency. And then that has follow-on negative consequences when you consider Hitler was born from the ashes of the Weimar hyperinflation, right? Currency collapse. When the currency collapses, people go crazy. The whole world breaks down. The entire symbolic structure collapses, let's say. And there becomes this rousing demand for strong leadership, law and order. And that's what led to Hitler. So,
without getting too much into the details, many people, I think, know the high level, Hitler and kind of somewhat of the rise to power, and then his attempted and thankfully ultimate failure to take over much larger areas of geographic land. But there's some scary nuance as you learn more and more about that situation, where even in American politics, there was a lot of people who were very supportive of Hitler for a very long time. And part of it was because there was this great fear of Russia. And so a little bit of the your enemy, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And then there was along kind of this journey or timeline, certain actions that Hitler and kind of his whole crew took, that then was the tipping point. Okay, fine, now I don't like it. Okay, now I'm worried. Okay, now there's a threat. But it's not like, to your point, that's a bad person. They have no power. They have no organization. They have no weapons. They have no anything. And we know that's a bad person. It's a lot different, right?
Yeah.
It's a much more complex story. Osama bin Laden is very similar in that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Maybe we should help that person defeat our enemy. And then the power consolidates and the weaponry and the training and all these things. And the next thing you know, it's like, oh, wait a second. Like actually maybe the ally is the enemy.
Yes.
And it becomes this weird thing. And it's a story as old as time, over and over and over and over again. But it is worth learning about for people to understand.
100%. And it follows the wealth, right? It follows the money. So the reason so much gold ended up in North America prior to the end of World War II, during World War II, was because Hitler would invade a country and he would plunder the central bank's gold supply. So enough countries had seen this happen, they started sending their gold across the Atlantic. So when enough gold ended up in North America, at a certain point, we were very reticent to enter the war for a long time. But at a certain point, it was like, well, we got all the gold. There's been enough devastation over there. We could probably just go clean it up, declare ourselves the victor, rewrite the global banking rules at the Bretton Woods Conference, and then be the global dollar hegemony.
Yes.
Which indeed we did and have been since 1944. And so
it's funny how it doesn't read that way in the history books.
it's funny how it's been rewritten by the winner, right? And so,
It also, simple things at the time.
Yeah.
How fast did the ships go?
yeah.
Right. And I think today people are so removed from a lot of this that we don't think like, oh, who has the faster fighter jet or who has the better technology? Like that competition still happens to a great degree. But at the time, like the difference between 24 or 30 knots literally could determine wars.
Yeah. Yeah. And still about power, right?
Yes.
Like energy channeled across time. The faster you can channel it, the more effective you are as a combatant or as an entrepreneur even, right? If you can move people in a plane faster than you can move them in a car, then people are going to prefer planes to cars, obviously. So the nation state is built on gold, as we just said about the United States. And for reasons we talked about in our last episode together, gold was already selected by the free market as money, right? It best satisfied 5 properties of money. But chief among those qualities that make gold good money is its scarcity, which was protected by the proof of work necessary to discover, mine, extract, refine gold, and use it as money. And so that, and this is the same thing that maps onto Bitcoin, is that expenditure of energy necessary to produce gold as it is to produce Bitcoin that secures the supply from counterfeiting. And as I've said a lot, inflation and counterfeiting are the same thing, right? The central bank is a global currency counterfeiting operation. That's all it is. It doesn't add any value. It's parasitical on the market economy. That when you break, like fiat currency has zero proof of work effectively. That's why it gets produced ad infinitum and leads to World War I, World War II, global debt to GDP at 350%, et cetera. But I don't want to dwell on that. I'm going to stay on the power track here. Proof of work basically means you need to expend energy to acquire the value of the money, right? You need to expend power to acquire the purchasing power, let's say. And this basically means you're protected from political power. If you hold gold, there's no political institution in the world that can arbitrarily say gold's not money anymore. And that's really important, especially in a world where Russian central bank reserves are being seized at the tune of $600 billion. Canadian truck protesters are having their assets seized for a peaceful democratic demonstration. You know, you need seizure resistance in this world especially. So I would argue that gold was a good proxy for power because it required power to obtain the purchasing power stored therein, right? It's skin in the game, it's symmetry. And you can't counterfeit energy. This is very key, right? If you want a money that can't be counterfeited, well, then root it in the thing no one knows how to counterfeit, which is the thermodynamic physical reality of energy itself. Cannot be created nor destroyed, cannot produce it without work. And so the nation state historically is the most politically powerful institution in the world, but I would argue it's only because they hold the most physically power relevant tool, which was gold, right? The state that accumulated the most gold became the dominant state in the world. So a little bit more on gold, and then we can move on. As I said earlier, the physicality is kind of a double-edged sword, right? So the physicality of gold, as we're talking about when the guards were securing the cash at Walmart, right? There's physical cash that requires physical security to protect it from theft or seizure from others. So in a physics sense, the physicality of gold makes it a good proxy for power, if that's how we're defining gold, in the sense that you have to expend energy to earn the energy that gold represents. But I would say in a political sense, and I'm going to define this more shortly, gold's bad because it incentivizes the centralization of gold into one location. And I think that's because gold's just not portable, right? We need money to be movable. It needs to be transactable. It's much better if I can beam money around the world at the speed of light than it is load a bunch of gold bars on a container ship and wait 3 months, right? If we're going to increase the division of labor, we need fast money. So another definition I've given is money's a tool for moving value across space and time. Gold was good at time, but not space. Currency's good at space, but because we break it from gold, it does not hold value over time. That's why dollars are a terrible store of value. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, Bitcoin perfects both of these effectively. So the lack of gold's portability led to the creation of this derivative application called currency. But then when you break it with that application, you have to trust someone to maintain the peg to gold. Otherwise, you radically empower the currency issuer. If they can just start producing currency with no check, meaning citizens have no option to redeem that currency for gold, then the issuing institution, which is the central bank, will grow and grow and grow until it pathologizes the whole world. That's what's going on in the world today, in my estimation.
When you think through the ramifications of that, so that's what's happening. What is like the biggest ramification that you identify?
Okay, guys, you might think that OKEx sounds like a new genius football formation. It's actually not. Charlie?
It's your new favorite crypto trading app.
You heard the man.
OKEx, come on!
Well, I think it is, and again, the next thing I want to do is define political power, which sort of rounds out the other side of this. So far, we basically said that physical power is the essence of being alive and everything we're doing in the world. But to maximize our physical power footprint in the world, to harness more energy and channel it across time, we need these symbolic structures, right? We're the animal that plays imaginary. Acting in concert enables us to move a lot more matter than we could in isolation, as you described with your example earlier. So, but the symbolic structures themselves, if they're just stories, they're subject to political power. And so I want to define political power as something born from the faith humans have in that symbolic structure and the roles that individuals play inside of it. So when you go into a meeting with, a representative of a sovereign wealth fund, right? He's just a guy playing a role inside of a symbolic structure that has authority over certain assets that may or may not invest in whatever project you're there to talk to him about, for instance. So but that gives the individual a lot of power, political power, that they can start to, again, follow their own incentives rather than following the laws, and bend things in a way that benefit them, perhaps at the expense of other participants in the symbolic structure. Because often there's an information asymmetry, right? An insider may know certain things that outsiders do not, and they can use that information to arbitrage and other activities to profit for themselves at the expense of others, which again, the central bank, I would say that's exclusively what they're doing.
Correct.
Right? It's a monopoly on currency production to externalize the cost, privatize the profit. So, and again, so political power exists everywhere that everywhere that we're being human, it exists to at least some extent. It doesn't matter, again, if it's your company, right? You've got company politics, surely. You obviously have state politics, country politics, all these things. But the symbolic structures and the power anyone has over you inside of them results from the collective imagination, right? Like you could always quit your job. You can always start a new company. You can always opt out of these things. So it's not a real physical power that the president has over 330 million apes in the United States. It's all premised on this symbolic structure, which has a political dimension to it as a result of us just being human. So Balaji said this yesterday. It's like we have to LARP these things into existence. LARP being the acronym for live action role playing. And it really seems like that's what we're doing. We have to kind of pretend, fake it till you make it, pretend these realities into existence. But then we kind of start to forget, like we just think it's real. Like we think the United States is some permanent fixture of reality, or any other country or any other company, whatever, maybe not companies so much. And we forget that it's just play. It's just imaginal, serious play that we're engaged in. And so a couple of these ideas that we've created that have been tremendously important, we've already alluded to this earlier, the idea of the individual, actually. This is one we take so for granted, it sounds funny for me to even say. But pre-Christ, the idea of the individual was not really that strong. It was about, they called it the paterna familias, I think if I'm pronouncing it right, the family, right? That you were just a component of the family. Typically, it was related to a very distinct geographical plot of land. They used to have like a fire they would maintain in the hearth, and they would always keep the fire alive. And if they ever had to move, they would move the fire, and it was symbolic of their ancestors. So the idea of like the individual, much less a sovereign individual, didn't exist in our symbolic structure pre-Christ. And I won't go into this topic. There's a great book called Inventing the Individual, where I got this, and I would just encourage people to check it out. With no idea of the individual, you cannot have an idea of private property. Obviously, it doesn't make sense that an individual can have an exclusive relationship to assets if you don't even have the idea of the individual in the first place. So it just shows you, like you said earlier, this segue of Christianity leading to the founding of the United States, and then private property, and then economic success stories like FANG stocks. You would not think that Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Amazon, Google are related to Christ that much. But when you understand how integral property is to the process of civilization, I think you can draw this through line. And so to that end, the US Constitution, in terms of symbolic structures, it's been one of the most successful that we've ever created. And it was, we're set up as a decentralized republic with checks and balances built in. And again, built on this Christian notion of honoring the sovereignty of the individual. So it's tremendous how...
In some way, the Constitution is the code base.
Yeah.
Right?
It is.
The Constitution is kind of that initial code base, and there are amendments, right? That there are changes, there are additions, whatever. And in some way, also, there is the ability to propose changes. There has to be discussion, and eventually there has to be a process as to which to reach agreement on those amendments or changes. But it is very similar to the creation of software, both in kind of the initial inception, but also in the upgrading of that document, those ideas, and at the end of the day, those words and language for a society.
And it's distributed cognitive software that we're writing, rewriting, stories we're building, we're inserting ourselves into, taking ourselves out of. I would take it a step further and say, the way you describe the Constitution sounds a lot like the way the Bible was written, actually, right? It was a long process, a lot of people, a lot of amendments, rejections, changes, etc. That's almost like the moral code base, or a moral code base, not a moral code base. And then the U.S. Constitution was like the legal ratification of that moral code base into something political.
Yeah. I think of the dictionary a lot too. Like there's a movie, I think it's like A Genius and a Madman or something. And you forget that like somebody sat down and was like, we are going to write a list of every word.
Yes.
And what the definition is, right? That was like the idea for the dictionary. And it is a database of words, and those words actually end up getting debated. And we have seen in recent times, some of the definitions have changed. Some of those definitions have been upgraded. Some people would argue that they actually are being changed for political reasons, right? Whatever. But it's a database of words that goes through these processes. And what's fascinating is that if a language is derived from all of us, there's like this one little group of people, Merriam-Webster, right, as one example, who gets to decide what is in their list of words.
Right.
Is that a collective decision, or have we outsourced words and definitions to an organization?
Right. Yeah. It's kind of a centralizing effect on that open source software we call English. And it's such a good point, because when you consider that the word is almost like the elementary particle of the symbolic structure, right? Obviously, like you need language to be a human to create these things. But my understanding of a word and your understanding of a word, like the degree to which language is useful is that the degree to which our understanding aligns on those words. But they obviously don't, right? You've lived a different life. You've had a different experience, as have I. You've heard the word used in different contexts, as have I. Now, on a very common word like "the," it's probably pretty sharp, our consensus on that word. But on some more abstract term, it might be a little more deviated. So this whole thing is like we're constantly engaging in dialogue to try and reach consensus on the meaning of words, and then use those words to create these stories that we live in. And integrity is key. The thing needs to mean the same thing over time. So to the extent, I don't know about this, but to the extent Webster or whatever political institution or symbolic structure is changing the definitions of words, and the word recession came up for me there, where I know
recession, the
male,
response,
female.
well, also things like the CDC expanded the definition of vaccine, these types of things. But also, what is even fascinating is it doesn't have to be maybe what I would say are the most controversial or debatable, where people get into the culture wars and things like that. The idea of political parties, Republican and Democrat, over the years, the stance on certain topics or the ideological kind of position of those political parties has changed drastically. Sometimes changes and then changes back.
Like a 180. Yeah.
But the word Republican or Democrat, the definition has naturally changed. And what's most interesting about it is that the definition from a objective standpoint may not change, but from a kind of understanding through society changes, because the ideological position isn't necessarily on every single topic written into the definition of what is a Republican, what is a Democrat.
Right. 100%. Yeah. Yes. It's
kind of like theory versus reality.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what you see with a lot of these concepts.
And I think that's why aspiring dictators historically seek to control the media and control the money, right? These are two very important symbolic structures for allocating and moving information. So I said the U.S. Constitution is one of the most useful symbolic structures we've created to date. And this, I would say that's true because the very pragmatic problem humans have been trying to solve for a long time is like, how do we preserve the relationship between us and our stuff? As we've said, property, right? That's the exclusive purpose of government. I know it's grown a lot and expanded beyond the scope of that originally, but that is really all we need it to do. The market can do everything else. The other way to say that is like back to the will to power. How do we preserve the extension of the individual will to power into the world so that if the entrepreneur goes into the world and engages all his ingenuity and faculties to create something other people value, we don't want other people to come and steal that from him, because then that disincentivizes entrepreneurship and leads to decivilization. So we need a security provider, as we said, to enshrine and defend that idea of property. And in that way, the property is, and I talk about this till I'm blue in the face on my show, but I really think I agree with Ayn Rand, property is the basis of civilization. There are no other human rights possible without property. If you can't preserve the fruits of your labor across time, there's nothing else beyond that. And so it's also the source of all this political strife, because the state exists to preserve property, and it is also preying on property through taxation and inflation. So, as you know, there's a great quote by Clausewitz, who's an old German philosopher in warfare. And he says, war is just the continuation of policy or politics by other means. So it's fighting over stuff. That's all we're trying to solve for here. Honestly, it may sound like an oversimplification, but I don't see where there's anything else there.
Yeah. The idea also of war ends up being the point at which some portion of the population intersects policy. So if you were to look at the United States, 330 million people or so, how many of those people could tell you what the policies of the United States are outside of laws? What is our stance from an economic perspective? What is our stance on a geopolitical perspective? What is our stance on climate change or on energy or in ecological preservation, or all these different things? You can go really, really deep in the rabbit hole. You can start with the really high ideas. Most people have no fucking clue. They're like, I go to work every day. I do the best to do a good job there. I get paid and take care of my family, and like, leave me alone, right? But when a country engages in war, that is the point at which it becomes policy has risen to the severity and conversation level that now everyone, for the most part, is aware of it.
Right.
Not 100%, but 90+% of people. And so in some way, whether they agree or not with the policy, if your nation is at war, you will be asked to participate directly or indirectly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that is like a very interesting way to back into, like, politics don't matter, don't pay attention, all that, until you get to the extremes. And then all of a sudden it's the only thing that may matter for an individual.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that quote. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you.
Yes.
Right? Again, when the situation of physical power comes to the foreground, right? Whether it's Hurricane Katrina or it's World War II, all of a sudden, everyone in that symbolic structure is oriented one direction, right? It's towards that in some way. So the danger, all right, again, we said this earlier, the danger of these things is that they're stories, so they can be corrupted. And I want to try and define corruption here. I would define corruption as participants inside of a symbolic structure that understand the rules and expectations to be one thing, right? There's consensus on the rules, consent of the governed, as we say in the US. If an individual operating in a position of authority inside that symbolic structure will now bend or twist those rules for private gain, and that does not apply to the public. Typically, it costs the public because they're often extracting resources that the public has generated through the market process. That is corruption, right? So bending a rule for private gain, bending a public rule for private gain, I would define as corruption. And this is like that phrase that we've heard recently, rules for thee, not for me, right? That's corruption in a nutshell. So again, symbolic structures, and could be a social institution, hierarchy, story, whatever you want to call it, necessary for us to live at the top of the food chain. But given the ethereal nature of these things, they're not real, right? That they can be twisted in the imaginations of people and the imaginations of inhabitants by others, right? You can tell a new story or a competing story. These are often called narratives too, right? Like information warfare, narrative warfare. And this is the domain of propagandists, rhetoricians, bullshitters, right? They're trying to feed you some false symbolic reality to get you to do something that they want you to do. They're trying to bend you to their will, effectively. And so that is corruption in a nutshell. And we know corruption precedes self-destruction, right? Have you ever had a corrupted hard drive? Have you ever seen the end game of a corrupt government? Look what happened to Enron, right? They bent this reality of public accountability for private gain and vaporized $70 billion of wealth in the process, right? Corruption is like, it's pathology, it's destruction, it's disease. And so the more we can prevent public rules from being bent, twisted, or broken to the end of private gain, the less corruptible the symbolic structure becomes, the better off we all are.
Yes.
And so what we really need, what humans need, is an incorruptible, which I think is the equivalent to saying an indestructible symbolic structure. Because if you can't corrupt the story, then you can't destroy the story. I mean, at least, I know this is a bit abstract, but seems about the same thing to me. And so we need a story to inhabit that cannot be rewritten by the winner, right? By the most violent. You need an actual story, hopefully based on something like principles, right? Truth, justice, freedom, all these things that we all want and seek. We have a natural inclination towards. We want that integrated into the symbolic structure that we inhabit. And so, you know, if it's justice, to just keep what you earn or get what you deserve, that's what the justice system is, right? And that's what our natural idea of justice is, just people getting what they deserve. So this is not something new. We've been attempting to do this for a long time. I think, hopefully I'm just throwing light on it in kind of a new way, but so in that world where people get what they deserve, I think that's similar to saying we have a world where property is unbreakable or inviolable. So people, what they work to create, they keep. And what is stolen is returned, right? Like that's the kind of the general themes of justice we would like to see in socioeconomic reality. It's where the relationship between people and their assets is a non-revocable relationship. And that would make all trade consensual, right? Because you wouldn't, in that world where you can't steal people's stuff. I always say this on the show too, there's two avenues to wealth acquisition. There's making and there's taking. To the extent that you cannot engage in taking, if I can't take stuff from people, I'm left with no other option than to go to work, right? Make something, trade with people. So the game we've been playing is trying to reduce the incentives toward taking in our symbolic structure so we can tilt people towards making. And if we had something like that, there was like actual inviolable property, an indestructible symbolic structure that would maximally amplify the individual will to power. All of a sudden, people would be able to go out and to the best of their abilities, create what they want for themselves in the world with the limiting principle of other people's will to power, right? You can't tread on other people to take their stuff. So everyone's almost, they're sovereign, right? This is the sovereign individual idea. And I would say that indestructible symbolic structure like that is absolutely necessary to maximize human freedom. We have to have a symbolic structure to the extent that it's not corruptible. It lasts longer over time. It produces more wealth. It creates more satisfaction of human wants. It increases the carrying capacity of the planet, for God's sakes. So like if you have a will to power, which you do if you're alive and listening to this, you would want this as a thing. And again, I think that's what the US was an attempt at, right? We tried to create this decentralized, less corruptible governance mechanism with checks and balances intrinsic to it, such that it would resist corruption. But I think also that is what Bitcoin is. It's the closest thing to an indestructible symbolic structure we've ever had.
Yeah, I agree with that.
These are rules that cannot be twisted or broken for private gain. It's essentially, and it's paradoxical in a lot of ways, but it's essentially this public utility used to facilitate the transfer of private property. Like two things we never thought we could get into one bucket, and we somehow have. Rules that can't be changed. It's based on a purely opt-in, opt-out social consensus. There's no coercion in it whatsoever. There's nothing hidden, right? There's not even the opportunity for information asymmetry because it's open source technology. So towards this idea which we've been working, I think Bitcoin is the greatest reach yet.
When you think of the rules, not rulers, right, idea, it does feel like the financialization of this software. In some way, imagine if the Constitution had a stock price or ticker price attached to it, and people could trade it. People may not put as much importance on the Constitution's words, the ideas, like all of these other components that we find so valuable the birth of a nation, the kind of North Star, if you will. If you are able, which is hard for humans, if you're able to look past the volatility in an exchange price, and you are simply to evaluate the system based on the technology, the ethos, and the idea, it is, I would venture to say, probably the only piece of technology that we have which provides rules without rulers, which allows for this coordination on a global scale with the ability for people to opt in or out. And as you said, cannot be used for corrupt purposes in the sense of the people that are actually using the system as people of positions of power and influence. Because I think one of the other things is when you hear rules without rulers, there's a difference between the ruler, right, having a government with a monopoly on violence or whatever, or political power, all this stuff, right, the president or prime minister or whatever. That doesn't mean that there aren't people that have positions of influence or power. A single mining node, right, or a single ASIC, that has a position. Now, it may be a very small position of power or influence in this larger network, but it is still a position. It is a seat at the table in that specific consensus mechanism part of the system. Also, individuals who simply just hold the asset have a position of power and influence. It may, again, be very small in the grand scheme of things, but it is a position. And so in some way, it is rules without rulers, but there are still people who are involved in this process. Because it goes back to this part of like the people make up the society, the people make up a kind of civilization. The people end up making up the network as well. Now, they may choose to exhibit their participation via buying and holding. Some people want to do it trading. Some people want to do it spending. But also they may say, no, actually, I want to coordinate resources to buy machines to secure the network. Or maybe I want to create content around it or whatever it is. But it's still, at the end of the day, people participating on an individual level. And that's what ultimately makes up this huge network. But it doesn't allow anyone to rise to the position of ruler, which is one of, if not the greatest advantage the system provides.
Absolutely.
This episode is brought to you by 8 Sleep. Good sleep is a game changer, and the 8 Sleep Pod is the best sleep machine. I sleep on it every single night. A great night of sleep allows you to be healthier, be more rested, and have more energy throughout the day. And on the brand new 8 Sleep Pod 3, you can sleep as cold as 55 degrees Fahrenheit or as hot as 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the secret of thermoregulation. Better sleep, better energy. Get yourself an 8 Sleep. You can go to 8sleep.com/pomp today to go ahead and get $150 off your order. 8sleep.com/pomp. Not only do I sleep on it every night, it literally changed my life, and I begged the founders to let me invest in the company. 8sleep.com/pomp. Go get yourself an 8 Sleep pod and get a better night of sleep.
Yeah, we're talking about, I mean, Bitcoin is a global decentralized organization. It's the first of its kind, right? So it's a leaderless, CEO-less organization, and it has a gigantic market cap. It's been stunningly successful in what it set out to do. And to your point, the individuals inside of that network are maximally sovereign or individually empowered. Their will to power is being honored such that they don't suffer kings, right? There's not an opportunity for political authorities to rise to power as much in a Bitcoinized world, because citizens can always vote with their wallet or vote with their feet. If you're not treating me well in a certain jurisdiction, I can take my capital and leave very easily, which is, obviously in countries today, a lot of that's inhibited through capital controls and all kinds of other bureaucratic machinations. So all we're talking about here is increasing the individual will to power holds the symbolic structure of government in check, right? It makes it accountable to its P&L and therefore accountable to its customers, which are citizens. That, I would say, is kind of the core problem we have on the fiat standard, is that government doesn't care about its P&L because it can paper over all of its losses by printing new money. That's why we get all these antiquated government organizations that never go away. And if you're not accountable to your P&L as an organization, why do you care about the preferences of your customers? You can just steal from your customers. So that, this is the problem. This is the human problem right now, is that we have the dominant symbolic structure in the world, extracts from us, and we don't have a way to cast, well, pre-Bitcoin, we did not have a way to cast a credible vote of no confidence and say, this doesn't work for me, Uncle Sam. I'm going to do something different. And Bitcoin is an emergent alternative to the whole game, right? It's like the first level playing field we've ever had, or the first true, equitable story, whatever you want to call it.
I almost think in some crazy way, if you've ever played backyard football or street football, and let's say it was in a neighborhood as a kid, and you showed up and you kind of sort of knew the kids, they lived in the neighborhood or in the general area, and you're playing a game, and you pretty much knew almost immediately, like, hey, this is a game where the rules are very well defined, or like, oh, you stepped out of bounds. Where's that of bounds? It's like kind of like lined up here, and you would very quickly be able to tell, like, oh, these people are going to bend the rules however to try to gain an advantage in the game. In many cases, although, yes, we do have the rules written down, we have seen those rules changed in what I'll call the legacy world. And so that can be around taxation, that can be around monetary policy, that can be around fiscal policy, and that can be around a whole bunch of other aspects. It is not to argue that they don't have the power to change the rules. They do. It is not to argue even sometimes that the rule changes aren't positive. Sometimes they are positive. But it is just that the rules can change unilaterally based on those in power. Yes, and there's unpredictability. The difference is if you showed up to play that backyard football and they had basically a granite, tablet and they had chiseled the rules in and it said, these are the rules. If you play the game, these are the rules we play by.
Yes.
And now there is no debate.
Yes.
It is, there are the rules and no one's going to walk over even with a eraser and a marker and, let me erase rule number 3 and write a different one. It is, they are literally chiseled into granite. That is two different environments. And that's, I think, ultimately what we're talking about is this like analogous situation where you cannot change the monetary policy.
Right. Yes.
And it does not matter how many people you get that want to do that. Because there have been people who have wanted to change, whether it's monetary policy, technical components, whatever. And they have even been able to loosely coordinate with more than 50% of the hash rate in the miners. Still cannot do it.
Right.
And this idea, which I haven't heard a lot of people explore, is that in the United States government, which I think most people would look at and point and say, this is a democratic government, and it's the best that we've seen so far. Can somebody come up with a better solution? Maybe. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But right now, this seems to be the best way of governance that the world has ever seen. We have 3 branches of government. And those 3 branches of government provide checks and balances on each other. In the Bitcoin ecosystem, we also have 3 branches. You have the developers, you have the nodes, and you have the miners. And those 3 branches of Bitcoin end up providing checks and balances on each other. And so when you compare those 2 things, I don't know if people can argue that there is a better way to actually protect the rules of economic trade than what we already know is the best system of governance we've ever created. We simply are now just copying and pasting it via software and technology for this new system.
Yeah. It's an upgrade of what the the spirit of the U.S. Constitution lives in Bitcoin.
Yes.
Right. And that the idea of the rules chiseled in granite, the immutable rule set, I would argue that is the bedrock of peaceful gameplay.
Yes.
I've talked about this a lot, right? If you sit down to play poker and the hand rankings or rules change every few hands, you're just going to go nuts, right? You can't play the game. How can you form a productive strategy when the rules are changing all the time? There's too much unpredictability in the system. So that's all we're saying with Bitcoin. It's like, just give us a level playing field and let people play the game of the market process, and let's just create as much wealth as possible to solve as many problems as possible.
Yes.
And the further point to it is that when they're immutable and changeless and open and transparent, it's all opt-in, right? No one's forcing you to use Bitcoin. And in the episode I did with Jordan Peterson, he talked about this, that it's kind of obvious. Kids only like to play games that are voluntary, right? As soon as you try to go and play a game with kids, like, here are the new rules and like, okay, bully, we're going to go over here and play, right? So there's this natural inclination to organize around the rules that are voluntary, open, clear, changeless. And kids do it. Like, how about we start doing it as adults, right? We actually learn something from kids in this respect. So to try to bring this thing full circle, as we said at the beginning, money is a proxy for power. And I decompose power into physical and a political sense. And I think Bitcoin is the best proxy for power we've ever had, in that it's a story that can't be rewritten by those that wield violence, right? This is very important. It's a story that can't be rewritten by the winners. It's a property relationship. So again, relationship between owner and asset that's virtually independent of the monopoly on violence. Like, if you hold your private keys in a proper custody schema, and I always recommend multi-signature, distributed geographically, you're very independent or isolated from the political apparatus. There's no law passing that can change anything. There's no confiscation or inflation that's going to affect you. And it's an incentive structure. It's a brand new symbolic structure that has very strong incentives that tilts all of humanity away from warfare and towards peace. And this is like probably the most beautiful promise of the whole thing. And it's a good proxy for power, in my opinion, because it's rooted in physical power through proof of work. You have to spend energy to gain the purchasing power stored therein. And it's also so that it's like gold in that respect, but unlike gold, it's more resistant to political power because it's dematerialized, to use Saylor's awesome word. And it has this, I would even say the Satoshi creation myth is part of this as well, right? It's a foundational to that symbolic structure, to the idea of decentralization that's encoded into Bitcoin. And it's the reason these other projects can't seem to achieve decentralization, right? They can't get the magic of that in a bottle. Not to say that it's not possible, but it's proven to be damn hard so far. And so I'm on the Satoshi creation myth, I'm reminded of that movie Batman Begins, where Bruce is coming back from his training in wherever he was in the mountains. And he's on the plane, I think he's with Alfred, and he says, "As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored. I can be destroyed. But as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be everlasting." So when Satoshi vanished, like, he took Bitcoin from some project that a guy started to this symbolic structure with no individual, right, to attack or denigrate or anything like this. So he transcended. Like, Satoshi is now just a symbol, right? We don't know who he is. He's just symbolic. And he's like the godhead of this mythological structure we've created in Bitcoin. And so I think Bitcoin is a fundamental reimagining of human civilization, right? We have a perfect proxy for power, if you will, something that optimizes the individual will to power and is bounded by the will to power of others. So my interests stop where yours begin, right? We can all push up against each other, but it's only through consensual exchange in a Bitcoinized world that we are productive. The taking strategy for wealth acquisition is less profitable than the making strategy. Its integrity is rooted in the laws of physics, as we've already said, with proof of work, and it's resistant to politics because it's dematerialized. So I think that's it. Bitcoin optimizes our ability to express our will to power and therefore lets us be free.
I'll leave you with one last part of this idea that I think is really important. You can't kill an idea.
That's right.
Which is a saying that I think as people understand a lot about history, they realize many of these ideas have been passed down. But there was a bifurcation of history. Ideas used to be passed down exclusively by word of mouth. I would tell you something, you would tell somebody, who would tell somebody, who would tell somebody, and then eventually their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids, and it would get passed all the way down the lineage, and it was all word of mouth. And at some point, somebody figured out we should write it down. And writing it down meant that that piece of paper had to survive. And there was great care that was put to have that piece of paper survive. And then the idea of, well, maybe we should multiply it so that if one gets destroyed, the idea is available in other places. And so you get kind of this history of how ideas got from inception all the way down to modern day. Bitcoin is the exact same thing. There is this idea of decentralization, of being able to create rules, not rulers, being able to build a system for economic trade on a global scale that is dematerialized, that uses economic kind of value protected by energy. It's an idea. Somebody wrote it down in code. And then that code was able to garner enough attention where it is protected to some degree. But it also was then multiplied and sits on every single node.
Yes.
And so if one copy gets destroyed, it still lives on. And so one of the key ideas that I think is really hard for people to wrap their heads around, a company is an idea. A building is an idea. The idea of a company or the idea of a building can actually not be killed. People will always know what a company is. They will always know what a building is. A specific company, the idea of Enron still lives on. But that company is dead. And so there's this separation between the idea and the asset. With Bitcoin, what is unique is that unless you were able to convince every single miner, every single node, and every single holder to essentially walk away through coercion, force, or whatever, the idea will never go away. But the asset will not either because of the multiplication effect.
Yes.
It's like having taken a idea, put it into books, and then have created millions and millions and millions of copies.
Yes.
You can burn 500,000, 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, 20, 500 million.
Yes.
You can't burn them all.
Right.
And I think that ends up being this kind of Hydra-like kind of concept that once people wrap their heads around it, it gives you a very different perspective as to what the future will look like, specifically related to a concept like this.
I love that. It's the anti-fragility of an idea, right? Of these symbolic structures. And it's, to your point, rooted in that technological reality of copying, right? When we create the printing press and all of a sudden the cost of book production collapses, you can burn as many Bibles as you want. The Bible as an idea is not going anywhere, right? It's totally decentralized. It's here to stay, basically.
There are people who can recite it without even reading it.
Right. And so Bitcoin is, again, just taking that principle a step further, right? It's replicated in so many different places constantly all the time that it makes it very close to indestructible or definitely anti-fragile at least. And so it's phenomenal, you know, and it's interesting how much, again, if we're just ideas, we're just genetic information, we're imprinting these ideas into the world through various substrates, right? Whether it's paper or digital. And then that somehow feeds back into us. Like we're engaging this co-evolutionary process that we call civilization. And so there's a moral imperative here. It's ethical, it's technological, it's pragmatic, it's financial. And, I just hope that all this talking we're doing about Bitcoin is helping nudge the world in the right direction.
The concept of Bitcoin has a lot of surface area. We've seen as a financial asset, as a technology solution, as an ethos, like all these different things. What I find so powerful for it is you can take a single idea, which is the Bitcoin system, and if it only had one surface area, it would not be nearly as valuable. Because in some way, Bitcoin is different for everyone. What is the value to you? If you are fleeing a country, the idea that you can now move your assets without having it confiscated is pretty damn important. You don't care about volatility. You don't care about cheap fees or any of these other things. You just want the ability to have sovereignty.
Yes.
There are other people who say, all of my assets are completely sovereign. I can go to the bank. I can do all these different things. The sovereignty aspect of it is not very important to my day-to-day life. But I send a lot of money back home to my family in another country. And so the ability to do that very cheaply and quickly is important to me. And so when you have that, what it does is it also opens the surface area of the addressable market. And if you really look at it, money may be the only thing that has an addressable market that matches the number of humans on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm not sure that there is another technology. The internet probably would be the one other technology that people would point to. There are plenty of people.
Language, right?
Language, right? Yeah, I guess is another one.
Yeah.
But there's not many of them.
Yeah.
And everyone speaks, everyone transacts. Not everyone uses the internet.
Right.
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 And so it's like this very weird thing where we're headed towards a world where these assets that you and I kind of think through and talk about, the person who adopts them or is interested in them 10 years from now, they're not going to care so much about some of these underlying elements. So I think a lot about sequence. 10 years ago, the technical components of Bitcoin were really fucking important because you needed to attract a certain type of individual who could then help to propel Bitcoin forward for the next 3, 4, 5 years. But we've gone through some of these regime shifts. The technical components obviously still matter for Bitcoin in terms of the security and the decentralization. But not a lot of people, or the majority of people, are not showing up now being like, you know what I love about Bitcoin? I love the difficulty adjustment and the beauty. Like,
right.
That's not the mainstream group of people who are showing up now. But a lot of them are showing up and saying, hey, the fact that with the backdrop of undisciplined monetary and fiscal policy, that no one can unilaterally change that, that's really important to me.
Which is corruption again. I just want to emphasize monetary and fiscal policy are both corruption.
And so when you then fast forward 5 years from now, I don't know what it will be at the time, but there will be something else that then is attracting people to the idea. Yeah. And to me, that's the beauty of this, is that it's constantly evolving.
It's beautiful indeed and indispensable in the current macro backdrop of the world where we're actively witnessing legacy symbolic structures collapse around us, right? Rome is burning. And so there will come a point where people may think they don't need the sovereignty aspect of Bitcoin because they trust their bank and they trust their brokerage account and clear whatever. There could come a point where that trust is diminished significantly to where they will seek shelter in an indestructible symbolic structure like Bitcoin. And so not only is it, as we said, indispensable to human freedom, but as the other ones collapse, there's going to be this like osmotic pressure, I think, that forces people into it. And I think this is where a lot of detractors just don't get it. They think it's some arbitrary choice. Like, do I choose dollars? Do I choose bolivars? It doesn't matter. Why would I choose Bitcoin? It's like, this is why. Because all of the other structures are being corrupted and breaking down. And so people will naturally, in expressing their will to power, they will seek shelter in the one that is resistant to corruption and destruction.
Without a doubt. Where can we send people to find you on the internet if they would like more ideas from your brain?
I'm on Twitter at Breedlove22, BREEDLOVE22. I've got a Substack, and then you can check out the What Is Money show, whatismoneypodcast.com. We're on RSS feed and YouTube. And thank you so much for having me, as always.
We could do this literally every day, and I don't think we'd run out of things to talk about. So I appreciate you coming, and we'll definitely do it again.
Thanks, man.